Say hello to Telefon FTK, a new spin on a slightly older FTK strategy that might just be worth taking a look at, even in this Tier 0 format. Now, just as a disclaimer before we get into the deck, this list is absolutely not optimal, and I'm sure you can make improvements over it. But what it is to give you an idea of what the deck can do in a basic framework to start off with. So, what exactly is this deck trying to accomplish? Well, as its name states, it is trying to kill your opponent on the first turn. Now, how exactly does it do that? Well, it takes advantage of two very broken cards, one of which is Amazoness Archer, a burn card that lets you tribute 2 monsters to burn your opponent for 1200 damage, which is very good. And then Telefon, a monster that can infinitely summon copies of itself from the graveyard. Now, if you're familiar with this deck, you may be asking, why am I not playing Cannon Soldier, which is pretty much just better than Amazoness Archer? Well, the reason why is because Amazoness Archer can't get hit by Bestials, and Bestials are everywhere in this format. If you lose your Cannon Soldier, you lose the whole game. But with Amazoness Archer, they have to specifically have a DD Crow, and you have to be summoning Archer from the graveyard to permanently get rid of it. Now, as for the rest of the deck, well, the Dark Worlds are here to draw through your deck and mill and just get the engine going, get bodies on the field, so you can eventually get the setup of having 3 Telefon in the graveyard, or at least 2 in the grave, 1 on the field, then 1 Archer on the field. As this will let you get the FTK combos, you have to have every Telefon in rotation for Archer. The Dark Worlds are excellent for that, as they let you draw an incredible amount of cards and summon a good amount of bodies, especially combined with the Danger monsters, which have been a staple in this strategy for pretty much its entire existence, but are very powerful in a deck like this, where these can not only draw cards themselves, but trigger cards like Brow to draw even more. And, well, your extra deck is full of enablers that let you summon more, draw more, add cards from grave to hand, add cards from deck to hand, as well as some going second power plays such as Zeus, or the Graph of Fusion, or Access Code in case you lose a die roll, as this deck has plenty of ability to play through a decent amount of interruptions and put some massive monsters on board to get an OTK out very quickly. A historically very successful deck, Dark Worlds just recently got a new structure deck, and this new structure deck gives them some very powerful tools that make this FTK much more consistent and much more powerful. But as for the specifics of the Dark Worlds, the most notable new one, Rainbow over King of the Dark World, is basically a second copy of Grapha, and the basics of these two is that they allow you to bounce a Dark World monster you control back to the hand to summon themselves, which is very strong because the entire gimmick of the Dark Worlds is that when they are discarded by a card effect, they have a trigger. For example, Grapha destroys an opponent's card, Rainbow searches a high-level Dark World, and Snow searches any Dark World card. Then, of course, Beige summons itself, Brow draws you 1 card, and Pearl reborns a Dark World from your graveyard. But one of the most unique ones is Genta, as this one breaks the rules. Instead, this Dark World discards itself to search the Dark World field spell, and if this card is banished and you control a Dark World card, you can special summon this card. That is very relevant because the Dark World field spell lets you banish a Fiend type monster from your grave, discard a Fiend, then draw 1 card. This is a pretty much 1.5 card Gates of Dark World trigger, which allows you to get a ton of advantage going, plenty of draws, and summons. The other relevant cards is Dark World Ascension, their field spell, which lets you summon their fusion monster, Dragon Overlord of Dark World, by either banishing material from the grave or discarding from your hand, which does trigger their effects. And Overlord is very good, as I'll get into later, especially in this deck. Their last card is Dark World Archives, which lets you discard a Dark World to buff Dark World monsters you control attack, which is decent. But the real impressive effect is that if a monster whose original type is Fiend is discarded by the effect of a Dark World card, even during damage step you can discard 1 card, then draw 2. This is a very good advantage engine, or effect, basically allowing you to have a trade-in that also triggers your other Dark World effects. In general, the engine just is incredibly strong, plays the interruption pretty well, and is shockingly not too susceptible to Bestials despite being all darks, as cards like Graph and Rainbow just summon themselves. They're not activated effects, so your opponent has to shotgun a Bestial as soon as they hit the grave, or these will hit the field. The main FTK engine is shockingly pretty small as far as the main deck is concerned. As discussed earlier, I'm running 3 Morphtronic Telefon and 1 Amazoness Archer. Amazoness Archer allows you to tribute monsters to inflict burn damage, and Morphtronic Telefon has the effect where when it's in attack position, you can during your main phase, soft once per turn, roll a 6-sided die, and gain life points equal to the result. Then, you can special summon 1 Morphtronic from your graveyard with a level equal to or lower. Now that is very relevant because Telefon is a level 1. You will always be able to summon him, and he can summon himself. It's a very, very strong effect. Not only does this let you get FTKs out, this lets you get basic link fodder for something like a Saryuya to keep extending. A very powerful card. As far as the more generically powerful cards, I'm running a pretty hefty Danger Engine, as these work very well with the Dark World to trigger their effects, draw you cards, and especially summon bodies, including level 8 ones, which will be useful as explained later. And these are also pretty good for getting copies of Telefon or Archer in the grave. The other generic cards I'm running is Tearlament Sharon. This is a pretty nice card that lets you discard a card from your hand, which unfortunately doesn't really trigger Dark Worlds, but it does let you get Telefons in the grave. Then you can mill 3, which is quite nice in this deck, and it's a level 4, which lets you make something like Dagars a lot easier. Pot of Avarice is excellent in this deck, as it has very few hard once per turn effects, and lets you keep your engine going. I'm only running 1 here because it's kind of bricky, but I'm almost tempted to run 3 just because of how strong it is in this deck. Then 1 for 1 lets you just summon a Telefon from the deck, or Parl if you, for whatever reason, need to. The extra deck is where things get very interesting, as there's a lot of cards you don't see very often but have very specific uses. Starting off with, I have Relinquished Anima and Linkribo. These are here to get rid of copies of Telefon off the field so you can reborn itself to keep Link laddering and Link climbing, which is a pretty decent effect. Then, Cross Sheep is very important for reborning important monsters from the graveyard, such as a Telefon or an Archer. And the main way to trigger that is by summoning a fusion, the relevant one being Grapha Dragon Overlord Dark World, a card that's very readily accessible and is independently strong. This can even give you hand trap and other thing insulation by just being on the field, preventing your main FTK combo from being interrupted. And going second, it's just an incredibly strong card with a big attack stat that can break through boards. Then of course we have Zeus, as this deck is running plenty of Xyz and needs some help going second. Another interesting card is the rank 8 Coach King Giant Trainer, which needs 3 level 8 monsters, a pretty hefty cost, but its effect is that you can, up to 3 times per turn, detach 1 Xyz material from this card, draw 1 card, and show it, and if it's a monster, inflict 800 damage. This does skip your battle phase, but this just lets you draw 3, and even burn a little to make the FTK a little bit faster. And this deck is running plenty of level 8, such as the Dangers, and Rainbow and Grapha. Then, Zombie Vampire lets you mill 4 from both players' deck, and summon one of them. They're pretty good for getting an important monster from your deck such as Telefon onto the field, and just in general milling. But it is quite risky, as this can trigger your opponents such as tier limit cards or Ishizu cards, but you'll sometimes just have to go into this. Then Dingirsi is here, as it's a very good going second card, especially of Zeus. And it's not too hard to make once again because there's a decent amount of easily accessible level 8s. Another important card is Dugares the Timeless, a rank 4 that most notably has 2 very relevant effects, both of which require you to detach 2 materials. The third effect gives a double attack of a monster you control, which is neat, but not the most relevant. What is important are the first 2 effects. one that skips your next draw phase and the other that skips your next main phase. Well, in this deck, you're probably not going to another turn. And the one that requires you to skip your draw phase lets you draw 2 cards, then discard 1. And this discard is an effect, triggering Dark Worlds and Dangers. The second effect allows you to special summon a monster from your grave in defense position. Very strong, but keep in mind that Telefon has to be an attack to get its reborn effect. So the most notable hit off of this is Archer. If you summon back a Telefon, it doesn't really do anything. Then Abyss Dweller, mainly for going first or even going second against Ishizu cards. And for going first, if for whatever reason your FTK combo isn't viable, if you can make an Abyss Dweller and maybe skip an opponent's turn, you might be able to make a comeback on the next turn. Then, Double Saryuya. A very powerful Link 4 lets you draw a bunch of cards and put them back, and summon a monster from your hand. This is pretty much the main way you're getting your important pieces like Telefon and Archer on the field. It's very accessible, and you can even trigger it up to 4 times with the power of Avarice, putting it back. Then we have Firewall Dragon, an icon of FTK decks, but very strong because this lets you recycle resources from your grave to your hand. And with the Dangers and Dark Worlds not really being once per turn, this is very strong. It also lets you recover, say, a Telefon or Archer, which is also pretty good. And it's not bad going second either, as you can even bounce back your opponent's cards. Access Code Talker and Unicorn are here for going second for breaking boards and OTKing easier. Now these following few replays are intended to give you an idea of how to play the deck. And, well, as you'll see, the basic philosophy behind playing deck is to just draw cards, summon monsters, draw more cards, until you have that Telefon on the field, Archer on the field, 2 Telefon in the grave. That's your main game plan, nothing else really matters. Now this deck is pretty consistent, although it can sometimes run into a wall where it just runs out of discard outlets. I would consider maybe running more Dangers, or more copies of Avarice, or maybe even a copy of Beginning of the End, just to kind of get more fuel going. It's a pretty customizable deck with a very flexible main deck. I've run a ton of different variations, and all of them have been pretty interesting. Now as for this version, I would say it's probably not quite the best one at FTKing. The Punk version definitely felt much more consistent. But not only has that deck been basically banned out of reality, this one is very much an improvement as far as going second is concerned. The Dark Worlds are excellent for that, and the Dangers are also pretty good. And the more flexible room in the extra deck means you can play a lot more going second monsters. And there's even some room with your draw power to run, low copies of side deck power cards such as maybe our Sphere mode, as you'll eventually draw into them with your draw engine, which is a very strong ability. As you see here, I'm looping stuff like Saryuya and summoning multiple monsters to just go through my entire deck. This is the second Saryuya. As you can see, I've hit another Telefon, which is nice because that lets me start looping more of them. I have my 3 Telefons in rotation and the Archer. This is the FTK, and as you can see, this is how the FTK plays out.